The 7 reasons why the Wehrmacht could not defend the borders of Germany. The German army of World War II is considered by many to be the most effective fighting force of all time. However, while they were able to carry out spectacular offensive campaigns during the early phases of the war, they failed to prevent their enemies from penetrating into the heart of Germany. Next in today's program, we are going to analyze the reasons why the once powerful German army found itself unable to entrench itself on its borders and contain the Allied armies. To do this, we have to go back to the early days of 1945. After the failed offensive in the Ardennes, the only hope of the German leaders was to organize an all-out defense in their territory, which would extend the war indefinitely. For this, all possible material and human resources had been mobilized, and the Reich's propaganda was in full swing to raise morale as much as possible. With their enemies on their original borders, the best slogan they could sell was to protect their sacred ground and thus defend the civilian population. Although territory that was not German soil had been lost to date, the German authorities hoped that this new factor would give the troops extra motivation and multiply their combat value. However, despite the efforts made, the last German defensive lines could not withstand the Allied attacks. This is due in the first place to the poor quality of the troops that made up the German army at that time. Combatants, mostly very old or very young, with hardly any military training, were now the base of this army. Although on paper it looked great, and made it clear that Germany still had millions of troops, the reality was that this mass of men had very little combat value. Although this factor is very important, it is not determinative in itself, especially in a situation in which you are on the defensive. However, the points that we are going to see below will further aggravate this bad situation. The next factor refers to the poor quality of the weapons and the lack of all kinds of supplies and ammunition. By the end of 1944, Germany had to mobilize the last men it could turn to, these being mainly the ones that would form the so-called Volkssturm, the Volksgrenadier divisions and, to a lesser extent, the Werwolf. While the total number of these soldiers is estimated to be around 7 million, the reality was that there were no weapons to equip them all. Because of this, in this final stretch of the war they resorted to all the types of weapons they had available, even going so far as to ask each man to bring his own hunting weapon and his improvised uniform from home. This affected the Volkssturm troops to a greater extent. In any case, and by way of summary, during these last months of the war the Germans were using a monstrous number of weapons of different models, without any type of standardization being possible. This led to a real logistical chaos, and many units found themselves using outdated material for which ammunition was no longer manufactured. In addition, due to this shortage, the soldiers had orders not to fire both their rifles and their artillery pieces when it was not strictly necessary, or what is the same, only at the moment in which they received the enemy attack. The next section takes us to fuel shortages, which translates into a total lack of mobility. After the destruction of its main fuel production plants in April and May 1944, and the loss of Romania in August of that same year, the Third Reich's fuel reserves did nothing but decline, until by 1945 they completely collapsed. This prevented them from being able to use both their aviation and their panzer or motorized divisions correctly, and forced them to fight in a war that was as static as possible. This is further aggravated when their enemies had just the opposite, and they had made speed and mobility their best ally. Thus, while the Allies made use of large armored formations, followed by motorized infantry that allowed them to advance hundreds of kilometers in just a few days, the German static divisions were practically fixed to the ground. For practical purposes, this made them easily cut off once the Allies made any break in the front. But if this were not enough, let's add another factor, this being that of a sky completely dominated by the Allies. This was a very important factor due, among other things, to the fact that it made movements in the German rearguard extremely difficult, and crushed any contingent of troops that went to try to plug in enemy penetration. In addition, it prevented any German counterattack, since it was quickly isolated and crushed by aviation, as was the case during Operation Bagration, the offensive in the Ardennes or Lake Balaton. On the other hand, this force was now not only attacking the German units but also destroying the factories, communication axes, and razing their cities. Finally, the Allies could get a good idea about the situation of the German forces due to the great aerial reconnaissance that they could make practically without opposition, while the Germans had no idea what was happening in the Allied rear, nor where they were going to deal the next blow. As a fifth point, we have the great extension of the front line, which between the entire defensive line in the vicinity of the Rhine, the Gothic line in Italy, and the Eastern Front from Prussia to Hungary, added a total of almost 3,000 kilometers of front. To this, we have to add the troops that were isolated in Courland, those that continued to resist in the French ports of the Atlantic, or the garrison in Norway and Denmark. This continued to mean that the depleted German units had to be stretched to the max, covering much larger front sections than recommended. Added to the issues we've seen before, this factor denied the Germans the ability to establish defenses in depth, and all they could hope for was to establish a thin defensive line. In this way, both the Soviets and the British and Americans were launching attacks continuously and without pause along the entire front, forcing the Germans to have to extend their weak units even more. So, instead of choosing to advance in a single sector towards the heart of Germany, the Allies set out to attack on as wide a front as possible, denying the Germans the chance to concentrate. The sixth factor on our list refers to the increasingly rigid orders that came from Hitler's headquarters, in which the troops were ordered to resist in indefensible or meaningless positions. In addition, in recent months the exact place where the armored reserves had to be located was also ordered, giving commanders less and less freedom. To give an example, this occurred during the defense of the Vistula River in January 1945, where a large part of the armored reserves were ordered to the front line, and were swept away by the initial attack of the Soviet artillery. To this we must also add that many of the defensive actions during these last months were directed by regional politicians and not by experienced soldiers, having perhaps the most catastrophic episode when Himmler was appointed commander of the Vistula Army Group. And finally, we have factor number 7 on our list, which this time refers to the situation of total superiority in which the Allies found themselves. And it is that although the bad situation in which Germany was could have been maintained if its enemies had been the same as them, the reality was very different. Instead of being weakened, Germany's enemies continued to have enormous offensive power, and except for some occasional shortages, they did not slow down at any time. Over and over again they hit the Germans in multiple sectors of the front, making concentrations of planes, artillery, tanks, and huge troops. So, and as a final recap, to summarize the reasons why the German army could not contain its enemies in 1945, we have to say the following. With increasingly worse quality troops and less training. With a very limited armament and ammunition, with very little capacity for mobility. With little air support, being overextended and fixed at the front, and with increasingly rigid and inflexible orders, they could do little against more numerous, better armed, and more mobile enemies. Well, what factor do you consider to be the most important of all those we have named? Would you add any more? If you want to analyze what was the casualty rate of both the German Army and the Red Army during this phase of the war, I leave you in the description the 2 programs that we uploaded in this regard.